So we want to welcome everybody. Thank you so much for either attending today live or viewing this as a recording. We are here, we're Intersectionality, the many parts of you, with our friends Zoe Small and Kalia Spence. They are part of our youth team here at the Peel Center, and we're really excited to have them. And take it away.
Thanks, Kala. All right, I'm just gonna share my screen and share some slides with everyone. And hopefully that is good. Everyone can see that?
I can see it.
Okay, that's what's important. All right, so yeah, we'll just go ahead and get started. Like Kala said, this is Intersectionality, the many parts of you. And just to introduce ourselves, my name is Zoe. I use she, her pronouns. I am the Youth Outreach Coordinator for the Peel Center, and I'm calling out of the Pittsburgh area, which I just moved to Pittsburgh recently. And I am finishing up a fellowship with Peel, like a year-long fellowship, doing youth work with Peel, and it's been a really crazy experience. I've learned a lot, and so this is kind of, I came into Peel really passionate about intersectionality, and Peel has done an amazing job of like helping me foster that passion and tie it to disability. So that's why I've gotten to co-create this webinar with Kalia, which is really exciting. So I'll let Kalia. Oh, and just for accessibility's sake, I'm going to describe myself visually as well. So I am a white woman with very short brown hair. I have brown glasses, and I'm wearing sort of a checkered blue and white patterned shirt. And I have a white background behind me that says Peel Center, Empowering Youth and Young Adults. All right, I'll pass it over to Kalia.
Okay, thank you, Zoe, so much. So I'm Kalia Spence. I am the Youth and Leadership Training Coordinator at Peel. One thing, I come from a communications background. I studied communications in college. So it was kind of naturally built into the curriculum a lot that we talk about intersectionality. So that's where I know of intersectionality and how I began to start incorporating it in my work. On a surprise, Peel is actually the first organization that I've ever worked with that has even mentioned or even thought about how intersectionality affects their work. So I'm really excited to share on behalf of Peel and with Zoe and the rest of the team what intersectionality is and what it means to you. And other than that, to describe myself for accessibility purposes, I am a Black woman. I am wearing clear glasses. I have 2 nose piercings, and I'm wearing a black scarf and a marble type shirt.
All right. Go along. So just kind of an overview of what today is. We're going to define intersectionality and talk about what the heck that is, because I know a lot of people are not as familiar with that term. I certainly wasn't until maybe just a few years ago. We're going to learn to identify and embrace all parts of our identity, whether that's disability or otherwise. And we're going to consider sort of what this all has to do with ourselves, with leadership, with being a person with a disability, being a young person with a disability, being a leader, all of that stuff, and how it all ties together. So first, to start off, what is intersectionality? I think that, yeah, this is a term that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So we're going to kind of unpack that a little bit. And some people, I think some people are just coming in now into the meeting, so welcome. Thanks for joining us. This is Intersectionality, the many parts of you. And we just finished introducing ourselves, and now we're sort of talking about what is intersectionality and defining it a little bit. So I'm curious if anyone has ever heard of this word before. If you have, please feel free to either unmute yourself if you're comfortable with that, or share in the chat what kind of your experience is with this word. In the meantime, I'll talk a little bit about sort of my understanding of it. So basically, intersectionality is the idea that there are many different parts of ourselves that all kind of intersect in different ways. So there's a picture here of a stick figure surrounded by arrows, all pointing to this person. And there's many different labels pointing to this person. So race, education, sexuality, ability, age, gender, culture, language, class. So it's the idea that all of these things intersect in order to make up this little stick figure person. And it's a little hard to see in this diagram, they're all separate, but these things actually all intersect and kind of compound on each other in order to create new experiences. So, you know, someone might have a disability and maybe be from a low income background, from a low class background, and that's going to create a new experience and a new challenge and just a new way of living for that person than if they, for example, had a disability and were from maybe a middle income background. So that's kind of the basic idea of intersectionality. We have in the chat, Erin says that I have heard about intersectionality before, but I'm excited to learn. And Calla says, what makes you you? And that's probably the best, easiest way to put it, is it's just the idea that there's a bunch of different parts of ourselves that all intersect to make up who we are. And then Erin again says, I think of it as all the roles I have in my life, being a mom, an employee, a woman, wife, business owner, Caucasian, etc. Yeah, I love that, definitely. It doesn't necessarily have to be these sort of like big categories, there's these big social categories. It can, yeah, just be being a mom, being, you know, your relationships to other people that all feed into making up who you are. Oh, go ahead, Kalia.
And I was going to say, I couldn't have said it better than what Zoe said, but for me, how I view intersectionality is the things as race, sex, class, gender, how that affects the way that I walk in the world, how that affects how people view and treat me in the world. And, you know, based off that, you know, me being a Black woman who's, I would say, middle class or lower middle class, who lives in a certain area, who lives on the East Coast of the city, and all the different experiences that I have, how do those affect how I interact with people? How does that affect how I advocate for myself, and how does that affect how others treat me? And based off of, you know, knowing who I am and the intersections and how my identities overlap, that assists me in navigating throughout the world and ultimately, you know, making sure that I am respected, appreciated, and that I can have a sustainable life.
I love that, Kalia. Yeah. Yeah, so that's, thank you all for sharing your knowledge about this word. It's totally fine if you've never heard this word before, because we're going to keep unpacking it today, and that's why you're here, to learn more. But one thing I want to do real quick before we delve too much further into this topic is just learn a bit more about each other. We're a pretty small group, which is actually kind of cool because we can you know, get to know each other a bit better. So if you're comfortable, feel free to share in the chat your name, where you're calling from, and something that people might not know about you when they first meet you. And you can, yeah, just feel free to share that in the chat, and that way we can all just get to know a bit more about each other. So, I mean, I can start. As I mentioned, I'm Zoe. I'm calling from Pittsburgh, and something that people don't always know about me, you know, I should have thought of this beforehand because this is my question. And I always get stumped on this question because it's hard to know like what people.
I have an answer.
Oh,
Zoe.
Quickly.
So Zoe we were talking yesterday, and I think the important part is what we're going to keep discussing through intersectionality is that there's kind of two ways people view you. There's the surface level of what people see of you, and then there's the stuff that, you know, you explicitly have to tell them for them to get to know you, know your experiences and things like that. Zoe just randomly stated yesterday that she what is it called? You were a broad student in Belize, and that's something that I was in
Belgium.
I was actually really shocked. I don't know why I was so shocked, but I was like, because I'm somebody who likes to travel, that's not something that people can tell just by looking for me. So when Zoe just randomly like, yeah, I was in Belize teaching, I'm just like, oh my God, you were in Belize? So
I was like,
Did we lose Zoe?
Has cut out, like, definitely.
Oh, there we are. Zoe came back.
Oh, sorry. Did I cut out for a second?
You did, but you're back now.
All right. Hi, everyone. Kalia, that's a really good example of like a travel experience that I've had that like you might not like know about me firsthand. Do you have an example, Kalia? Something people might not know about you?
Since I did one about you, how about you do one about me? And
this
is just a clear example of how, when we first meet Zoe, I see as she announced herself earlier, she's a white woman who wears glasses, and I'm a Black woman. I mean, I guess we have the glasses thing in common, but how we have to get to know each other above like the kind of surface. So I'll let Zoe share something about me.
I love that. Well, I mean, this is an example that I learned about Kalia pretty early on, but I learned that she loves video games. And I guess I just like wouldn't have known that unless just by looking at you, unless you told me that about yourself. And maybe that's like on me for not assuming, I don't know, that women can't play video games or something, but I definitely learned that about you. And then now knowing you, it makes total sense because I think you love to do that kind of thing. But that's something that I learned about you after getting to know you a little bit.
And I think when me and Zoe both shared kind of like what we've learned about each other. If you notice when we were talking, it was kind of like it was not a surprise, but at the same time it was a surprise, right? Me telling her that I love to play video games. That's all I do all day. And her saying yesterday that she's traveled abroad. Again, not saying that because of the things that people automatically view about us firsthand, the surface, that we don't assume that women or white women, Black women can't do these things. It's just what I mean. It's just naturally a shock to us to learn, or it's very interesting that we've learned below the surface these things about each other.
Yeah, and I see that lots of people are saying awesome things in the chat, introducing themselves. Someone says they have butterflies in their checkbook. That's definitely something that you wouldn't know about someone. I love that. Diane sharing about their family. Hi, Ezra. Yeah, thank you guys so much. I'm not going to read all these aloud, but feel free to check out those in the chat because I think that's such a good example of, everyone has a story and everyone has parts of their identity that you might not know right away. Ezra does not like mushrooms. Ugh. I love mushrooms, but I can understand this and I can respect this. So that kind of feeds into the next part of intersectionality, which is what the Peel Center works with and what we which probably gathering a lot of you here today, which is disability. And so I wanted to ask you all to think a little bit about what does it mean to have a disability? How would you define this term? And you can feel free to just think about that for yourself. But something kind of cool is that 61 million adults in the U.S. alone, just in the U.S., are reported as living with a disability. So that's about 26%, or 1 in 4 adults. And there's a graphic here of the United States, and of it's filled with people, and 1 in 4 people are highlighted. 26% are highlighted as having a disability. And I love that statistic because I think it just shows like this is not something that's necessarily talked about a lot. And it's not talked about a lot, the intersections of disability and other identities, but it's so prevalent and it's so important. And it really does impact, this graphic says disability impacts all of us. And like, a lot of people like to say that, maybe all of us have a disability. Maybe disability is just sort of a thing that is created socially, and there are some people that are considered disabled and not others, but we all have a spectrum of things that we're able to do. And Kala, for a possible definition of disability, says doing something differently than most other people. I love that. Yeah, it's just about maybe you do things differently than other people. Maybe you have different access needs. Things like that. Erin says, I believe lack of access creates disability, not a diagnosis. Right, exactly. So yeah, feel free to think think about that a little bit. I've heard someone say, a young person on another call when we did a similar training said that disability is just not being able to do something, not being able to do one thing. But that doesn't necessarily impact. Maybe it impacts a big part of their life. Maybe it impacts a small part of their life, but it looks different to every different person. And I just sort of wanted to talk about that real quickly, because that's something that probably unites all of us on this call, is an interest in disability and thinking about how it impacts our day-to-day life.
And to go off of Zoe's point, when you look at that number, 61 million in the United States, especially how big the United States is a big number. And not everybody, while everybody has in common that they have a disability, not everybody has everything in common. And that's where intersectionality comes in. Some people identify with a disability and identify as being Black. Some people identify with a disability, identify as being white. Some people identify as being from a different country in migrating to America. Some people who have a disability can be upper class, some can be middle class, some can be lower class. There's different ways that people who have a disability, how they interact with the people around them, with the systems around them, and with how they just view the world entirely. And that's important. Like, for example, I like video games, but not everybody doesn't like that, right? Somebody with a disability can, as Ezra said, he doesn't like mushrooms. Somebody cannot like strawberries. It could be as simple as that. And then other people can like strawberries. Everybody is different. And that's the important part that we want to reiterate with intersectionality, is while everybody has things in common, but everybody also has a lot of differences. And how do those differences affect, how they interact, how they view themselves and how they view others in the world.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, well said, Kalia. Yeah, so that, exactly. So that's sort of, for one part of intersectionality is disability, but the broader picture of intersectionality, we've sort of thrown around a few different ideas of what this word could mean, but just to kind of reiterate, basically it's just the idea that there are many different parts of ourselves that all intersect to make up who we are. And yes, exactly as and one part of this could be disability, one part of this could be many other, your background, where you're coming from, all of these different things kind of come together. And this word was actually coined by a scholar, by a professor named Kimberly Crenshaw, and she was a lawyer. And I believe this word was coined in the 1990s. And she came up with this word because she noticed that a lot of times when we talk about identity, we only talk about it in very segmented and kind of siloed terms. So we only talk about it as there's race, and there's people who are impacted by race. And then there's gender, and there's people who are impacted by gender. So, men and women, and they might not get, equal pay at their jobs, things like that. There's issues that face women. Then there's issues that people with disability might face, access to buildings, getting the support that they need, things like that. But she noticed that we had a gap in the way that we talk about how all of those identities might overlap. Like, for example, if there was a person who was not white and not a man and had a disability, and how all of those things coming together might give them a unique experience in the world. And she noticed this because there's a case that sort of created this term for her and created this whole movement, this intersectional movement, was that there was a case where there was a Black woman who was trying to get hired at a job, and this Black woman couldn't get hired. And the company said, well, we don't discriminate against people who are Black, and we don't discriminate against women, because we have Black men working here and we have white women working here. But Kimberly Crenshaw said, well, hang on, what about people who fall into both those categories? And that kind of exploded this whole movement. And so that's all kind of like legal jargon, but this is all to say that now where we've gotten to now is kind of the idea that there are a lot of times different parts of you that all come together to make up who we are. And a good friend of mine, Chaz Kellum, likes to call this an iceberg, because he points out that there are some parts of us that are more visible to people while some parts are hidden. And so just like the example that that Kalia gave, that she didn't know that I had traveled abroad before, that's something you wouldn't know about me just by looking at me. That's a part of me that's hidden. Another part of me that you might not know right away is that I identify from the LGBT community, or you might know that getting to know me, but it's maybe not something that you know right away. So things like that are kind of hidden are also just as important parts of making up who we are. Kalia, do you want to talk about the questions you just put in the chat? Those are great questions.
Yeah, I was just thinking about some questions that those who are currently here with us and those who are watching the recording can ask themselves, right? So how do you think others see your identity when they look at you? As Zoe said, when we're looking at it, as Chad said, and Zoe, as an iceberg, kind of the surface things, and how do those surface things kind of affect others' assumptions about your identity, or how do, when you look at somebody, what do their looks, or how do they look, what they're presenting to you, how do your assumptions about their identity contribute to sometimes having unintentional biased thoughts, attitudes, or stereotypes, right? And I can be honest here with you guys. I think that's important. And when looking at me, right, you're going to first see me, you're going to see that I'm Black, and then you're definitely going to see that I'm most likely more likely chunky than most other people, right? People are going to assume that I'm out of shape, or that I don't go to the gym, when in reality I go to the gym almost every single week. And that me being Black, people's assumptions are going to be, I don't have to reiterate all the things, but they're going to assume things that are negatively associated or positively associated with the Black community about me. And in reality, a lot of those assumptions, a lot of those biased thoughts or negative stereotypes, I don't associate with, excuse me. And in order, right, for people to know that I don't associate with or recognize that those stereotypes are not who I am, they would have to get to know me. Or even me knowing that I'm walking in this world and that people are going to automatically think these stereotypes about me. As I stated before, how do I, knowing that people are going to think this about me, how do I navigate in the world? Right. So these are important things when we talk about the iceberg, is like all that surface stuff. That's where a lot of bias and negative stereotypes comes from when people are looking at you. But everything in the bottom, everything under the ocean, that's way much more about yourself, about me, you know what I mean, about your friends, that you know is much more than the surface. Sorry. I hope that made sense, because I lost my train of thought.
Yeah. No, I think another way to think about this maybe is just, what's something that you notice about, like, what's the first thing that you notice about yourself when you wake up in the morning? Or, another way to think about it is maybe, have you ever walked into a room and felt like maybe you're different from everyone else? Or like, what do you notice about yourself in comparison to everyone else? And those kinds of questions, if you're kind of willing to sit with them and think through them, will start to create some idea of maybe how you think of yourself and how other people think about you, exactly like Kalia said, kind of the biases that accumulate at the top of the iceberg.
Right. And you can even think about or ask yourself or put it in the chat, what can't you tell by looking at somebody? And what are ways that, you can get to know that person, or how can you combat, just by not looking at somebody, some of the ideas that you may have about people.
Right, exactly. And people are sharing some really vulnerable, powerful things in the chat. So I'll, feel free to look through those. Just the idea that people might make assumptions about us based on whether we're using a mobility device or not, based on, if they can tell our gender or not just by looking at us. It's kind of this, these assumptions and these boxes that people put us into, right, when they look at us.
And on that point, Zoe, side note to share, like sometimes, you know what I mean? I have a very vast, I guess, collection of clothes, whether it's, I guess, super dressy or super bummy, as some people call it. Sometimes I'll walk outside wearing a certain outfit, and people will assume that I'm a part of groups, or sometimes that I'll walk out wearing certain things and people will assume this is something that I get a lot because I like to dress for comfort. And that is because of the intersections and the overlaps I have where I grew up, you know what I mean? And a lot of people dress for comfort and not necessarily to impress others. So me dressing for comfort, people automatically assume now that I moved and now that I'm in a different environment that I'm like lower class, or that you know what I mean, I make a certain amount of money, or that they make more than me, when in reality that is not the case. I like to dress for comfort, not necessarily to show my wealth, right? Or to show how much money that I make, or to show that I can afford certain things that other people can't afford. And that's something that I've been having a conversation about lately with a lot of people, is that when what I wear doesn't define how I work, how professional I am, how much money that I have in my bank account, you know what I mean, what I can afford, what I can't afford. It's just how my preference and how I like to dress. And unfortunately, because of that, you know, people assume things about me on the surface, which in reality, that's not the case.
Right, and it's interesting that you bring that up, like the way that people assume things about you just based on like the way you look or the way you dress. Because like for example, I'm pretty skinny naturally, but I'm in horrible shape. I'm very out of shape, but people just sort of like assume that just because I'm a smaller person, like they assume certain things about me. And so just things like that, like you really can't make assumptions like that just by looking at someone. So yeah, and we have in the chat, education, class, and religion are just a few of the things that you can't tell just from looking at someone. Right, exactly. You know, you can't assume just based on the way that someone's dressed or the way that they look, really anything like that. Mental health issues, that's a really good iceberg example, that there's, you know, often a lot going on below the surface that you wouldn't know about. You know, maybe you see someone and they seem really put together, and you know, you think, oh, like they're doing fine, but in reality there's a lot more going on, especially right now with COVID and you know, coming out of the pandemic, a lot of us are still struggling with some of those mental health issues. So yeah, definitely. Well, this has been a really good conversation, but just to keep on time and moving forward, I just want to show a quick video, and I think this video does a good job of talking a bit about the sort of more of the wow, what am I trying to say? More of the activism side of intersectionality. You know, we've talked about the ways that it impacts ourselves individually, but this video talks a bit more about how intersectionality affects larger groups. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen and then share it again so that I can share sound. And thank you guys for bearing with me while I do that, and feel free to keep, you know, thinking about all of this stuff, mulling it over for your own identity. And now we can play.
My name is Carrie Gray. Carrie Gray is a Black disabled woman, and there's power behind that. In the United States, 1 in 4 in the Black community have some type of disability, whether that's visible or invisible. Historically speaking, organizations and institutions have shown us that they want to identify with one thing and build power around that, build influence and access. And I get it, right? So this idea that you have disability rights, you have women's rights, you have LGBTQ rights, and those kind of different pockets are really building a strong narrative. But the thing that I find to be harmful is when we're not building in coalition. Because the reality is that you have people like myself who are Black, disabled, and women, and so many other things. And when you live at the intersections of all 3 of those, then you can't split your political and social dynamics between these different groups. It doesn't produce real results of freedom, and it doesn't produce real results of access to employment and other opportunities that you're looking for. I'll give one example on this. So the Black Lives Matter movement. When it was created in conjunction mostly with a lot of young folks. What was unique about this particular movement was the intersectional philosophy that was built upon. the folks getting up and saying, we are not just fighting for one narrative, but we are specifically fighting for folks who are on the margins. We are fighting for Black folks who are also LGBTQ, who are women, who are femme, who are trans, who are disabled. They named it. They saw like their people across the country and said, I'm fighting for all of you, not just some of you, not just the ones that have traditionally gained power and access. And that gives me a lot of hope, because no one wants to be left behind.
So disability justice is a term that was coined by Patty Byrne.
Sorry about that. You'd think after this long of being on Zoom that I would, have more of a grasp of this, but there we go. So if anyone has any reactions to that video, feel free to share them in the chat. I know a lot of you have seen this video before, and because we've used it in other Peel events that we've done, but I've seen it so many times now, and every time it really speaks to me, because she talks about the fact that we're able to do so much more when we recognize that we're all in some way impacted by the same struggle. Obviously people with disabilities have every person with a disability has their own specific struggle, but there's things that impact all of us, regardless of disability. And that's just, the ability to feel welcome and to feel in community and to feel seen. So.
Right. And if you think about your strongest identity, the one thing that you identify with the most, I'm pretty sure that there has been times where you have been around people who share the same identity, might not share the same strength about the identity, but have been in the same spaces and might have still felt as though you necessarily don't fully belong, right? So for example, my strongest identity is I identify with Black, but there have been plenty of times that I have been in Black spaces and have not felt as though that I have particularly belonged, because I am also a woman, because I identify with certain political beliefs, right, compared to other people, because of, all those things behind the surface that you don't know about me that I identify with. There has been plenty of times that I have not also, like, my identity, why I feel so strong about it, spaces with other people who also identify with it, I've not felt like that inclusive or that safe being around them. And that's, as Carrie said, sometimes, the services that you receive or the services that we provide, right, they are inclusive to one thing. And I think that's the good thing about Peel and what we're doing as Peel is that we want to be inclusive with everybody. So, when you think about, I think that's something that I want to hear if anybody has any thoughts or anything to share about your strongest identity, whether it's you being a woman, whether it's you being part of the LGBTQ, whether it's or you being a certain race, your class of where you've strongly identify with that, but in certain situations, it might, when you're around people of similar stature or nature, that technically hasn't always been the case. But I think that's what not side note, but I think that's what Carrie is trying to say. Like, organizations, you know what I mean? Like, as we're doing at Peel or even in your own life, that there's much more to just one thing. And her being a disabled Black woman, she doesn't want to, and she shouldn't feel as though she only has to walk into a space and be one thing, that she is allowed to be multiple things. And I think that's an important part of intersectionality. We want you to get across to you is that you can be one thing, you can be all of your identities at the same time in the services that you receive, the services that you provide, or even in your spaces with your family or your friends, that you are allowed to do that. And yeah, I'm just going to pass it back to Zoe.
No, I love that. That's such a good question, that question about, what is your strongest identity? Because it definitely does change. Like I relate to that, at least for me. Like sometimes my strongest identity is that I'm a woman and I'm female, But sometimes I walk into a room with many other women and I realize that I'm different from them, because I don't really see my another aspect of my identity, being part of the queer community, being represented. And so sometimes that kind of shifts, and then that becomes the strongest. Or, just last month was Pride Month. And so I was thinking a lot about being a part of the queer community, and that was a really important part of my identity. So, it's definitely not like a one and done thing. Just think, oh, this is the most important part of me. It definitely shifts and changes. We have someone sharing in the chat that they said, I remember when my son was born with a disability, and when I shared that with people, they would be like, oh, I'm so sorry. Why? He's a very happy, healthy baby. Yeah, right? Like, exactly. Like, people making an assumption about the kind of life that your son is going to lead. But why is that an assumption that this person, that, your son, and that you wouldn't have a beautiful experience, and a beautiful life? That kind of thing. That's a great example of an assumption that we make, and sort of narrowing someone down into just one thing. And I'm sure there's many other parts about your son that people would never know if they just made some sort of flat judgment just based on his disability status. So the next part of this, and what this kind of is all leading up to, is to think about all of these social identities and all of these different parts of who we are for ourselves. And this can be difficult if you've never done this before. I think a lot of you probably have in this group, but if you've never done this before, I'm gonna sort of talk and walk through a little bit about what this looks like. So on the side here, I have a lot of different identities that you might possibly identify with. Maybe you don't, maybe you don't think about these at all, and that's totally fine. There isn't one right way to do this, but Kalia and I are sort of going to lead you through the process of thinking about some of these identities for yourself. So some examples are what we've mentioned already: race or ethnicity, which has to kind of do, with how you present, your physical features, things like that. And again, that people might make assumptions about when they meet you. Your gender, which could be male, female, or anywhere in between. Class, whether that being lower class, middle class, upper class, or again, anywhere in between, kind of like your financial background, where you're coming from. Sexual orientation, which again could be, it could be really anything, could be all sorts of different ways, all sorts of different identities for sexual orientation. We have culture, which again has to do with kind of where you're coming from, maybe where your family's from, what kind of food, dress, like all those things that kind of make up culture. Disability, again, like the sort of all of the different things that go into that. Age, I think our identity does change with our age. I definitely think of myself differently than I did just a few years ago. Language, what language you speak at home, what language you speak fluently, other languages that you may speak. Nationality, again, kind of where you're coming from, if you feel really strongly connected to your nationality. Religion, if that is something that you identify with, and that is something that kind of makes up your identity, and so much more. Like there's many other identities. These are just some examples, and we're just giving you kind of all these terms so you can start to think about, I don't know, do I really identify with my culture? Is that something that I really, really think about a lot, my heritage, or is that not something that's as important to me as, maybe as my race or my class or other things? Maybe the language that I speak is really important to me, or maybe it's not. I grew up speaking English. It's really the only language I speak fluently. So for me, it's not really something that I think about a lot, but for other people, it's probably something they think about all the time, maybe because they don't speak a language that's predominantly spoken. So that's something that's really important to them. So, you might identify with these labels in different ways, but we're just giving them to you so you kind of have a language to think about it. And someone asked in the chat, isn't this month Disability Pride Month? Yes, it is. I'm so glad you brought that up. July is Disability Pride Month, which is super important. It's the anniversary of the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so I think there's a lot of cool virtual and in-person activities going on this month. So that's a great thing to bring up. I don't know, Clea, do you have anything else to add on this slide?
You answered You took all my talking points from me. So
I love that. Awesome. All right. So now that we have a little bit of this language and a little bit of like what all these things are, we're going to kind of walk you through the process of creating what's called an identity wheel. So the idea behind this is really that starting to think about yourself and the way that all of these identities intersect within you can be really helpful. Can be really helpful for helping us to understand who we are, and that can be helpful for going out into the world and just like being the amazing, awesome, cool people that we are, because you're able to kind of understand your experience and understand your identity. So real quick, I'm going to go through my identity wheel with you all, just so you can kind of see an example of what this might look like. And then I would really encourage you to do this on your own. Kala rocks and just put an example of a blank identity wheel into the chat. So feel free to do this along with me, or you can do it on your own. And this is blank, and it doesn't have any of the labels, any of the categories on it, because I want you all to feel free to, rather than have to put yourself in boxes, I want you all to feel free to think about which identities that you might want to identify yourself with, and think about that. So I'll go through this one with you all. Again, this is my own identity wheel that I put together. So, so for race, I have white. For ability, I have able-bodied or non-disabled. For sexual orientation, I have part of the queer LGBT community. For class, I have middle class, coming from middle class background. For language, I have English. For education, I have college educated. For age, I have 22. And then for gender, I have female. And so I kind of chose all of these categories because they are probably the ones that I think about the most, and probably the ones that I, think that and it's also the ones that I think other people might notice about me. So feel free to, oh yes, Ezra, yes. So the template that Kala put in the chat is something that you can print out and work out on your own if you want. Or again, you can just literally draw a circle and some lines on a piece of paper, whatever feels right for you.
yeah, I didn't finish mine, but I'll show you my horrible circle.
Yeah.
I don't know if you guys can see it because I drew with red pen. But like for me, I put that, you know what I mean? I'm Black, I'm a woman, I'm a college grad. I grew up in poverty, but now I am middle class, right? One thing I really identify strongly with is that I used to be served by the system. I used to be in foster care, and I think that's a very important for me and a very important part of my identity of how I view the world, how I view systems, social work, things like that. But I didn't finish the other two. But you know, as Zoe said, you can just draw a circle like mine and put what you want to put in there.
That's a great example. Yeah. And that's something I love that you mentioned that affects your worldview. That's another way of thinking about it, is if you're thinking about what experiences have I had, you could even put an experience down by, my experience being, maybe if your experience being a parent has really shaped your worldview, that's another huge part of your identity. That's not something necessarily that is on my identity wheel, but it might be something that really impacts your experience and your worldview. So,
and one thing that sorry, one thing I wanted to mention, and I think this is an important part where we talk about identities below the surface, and something that I don't have to worry about. And this is not saying because I view the world this way, because I don't. But one thing that I think it's important and that people are starting to recognize is that the social constructs of the world, and that means kind of like the labels or the type of hierarchy, right, systems put on people. And on Zoe's wheel, you can put that, she put sexual orientation, that she identifies as queer, a part of the LGBTQ plus population. But unfortunately for me, I don't even have to think about that because straight is seen as normal. That's not something that I have to walk around in the world and worry about. And I think this is, again, it kind of hammers in the point when we talk about intersectionality, is that some identities are not really important to us, while some identities to others are really important, while I don't have to walk in the world and be discriminated against for being straight, that's something that Zoe, you know what I mean, other people have to worry about. And that's something that she identifies with proudly and positively, while being straight to me is just like, it's like water, it's just there, you know what I mean? And because of social constructs, I don't have to worry about that. And even though we definitely should question in our identities, and definitely how we identify in the identities that, you know, we strongly associate with, that questions the social construct. But also think about that when you're putting down your identities. Like, for example, you know what I mean, Zoe identifies as white. She doesn't have to walk around worried about in the world about certain things compared to me. So I think that, like, when doing my will and I'm looking at Zoe, so I'm like, oh, I didn't even think about putting my sexual orientation down, because that's not something that I automatically think about.
Yeah, yeah, and you know, someone put in the chat that talking about um, another person in the audience, that they have so many awesome parts of them that make her unique. Hairstylist, voter, jet skier, friend, sister, daughter, employee, music fan. You know, those are also totally parts of us that make up who we are. You know, maybe they're not as they don't feel as huge as something like gender or race, but they're also, you know, big parts of us and our identity. So yeah, I hope that you all think about this wheel, and if you choose to do it on your own, kind of sit with it and think about, you know, how, and this might be really difficult. If this is something you've never done before, I kind of raced through mine because I've like talked about it a lot, but if it's something you've never done before, you know, feel free to sit and think, well, hang on, how do I identify? And is this a category that I even want? You know, maybe I think the category of you know, gender is silly, and I don't even want to identify with it. So feel free to kind of sit with this and give yourself some time to do it. So now we're just gonna think about now that you've done the identity wheel, or if you haven't done it yet, this is just something to keep in mind for the future. Exactly as Kalia said, to think about which labels you identify with the strongest, and also maybe which ones you're most proud of. Like, I think the reason why I'm most proud of my identity as someone who's part of the queer community is that it took me a long time to come to terms with that, and I didn't always identify that way, and it kind of scared me to identify that way, but now it's something that I'm really proud of, and really you know, want to be a voice for other people in the community that maybe don't always have a voice. So that's another way to think about it. And then again, to think about visible versus invisible identities. What parts of you do you think people notice right away? What parts of you maybe would you have to be more vocal about? You know, again, things like mental health, class, religion, that people wouldn't realize right away. And feel free to mark those on your wheel if you want. You know, maybe you can circle the ones that you're really excited about. You can maybe put a question mark next to the ones you're not sure about. Again, this is for you, so make sure to do whatever you think feels right for you. And then just remember that you don't always have control over how people see you, but you can always decide who you want to be. And this wheel will hopefully be kind of empowering and help you realize that you have, you know, you get to decide which parts of these, which parts of your identity that you really want to focus on. And again, people are saying awesome things in the chat. Ashley says, if you don't have to think about it, whatever part of your identity, then that's a part of your identity where you exhibit privilege. And we all have different settings. It's very fluid. Yeah, definitely. Privilege is a big part of intersectionality that we've kind of touched on. And that's definitely something to kind of reflect on and think, oh, if I've never thought about that part of my identity before, it might be because maybe I'm the majority.
Yeah. And I think that's the point. That's the point I was making about the sexual orientation. It's something that I was looking at the wheel and kind of mimicking the categories that Zoe put, and I didn't even think about my sexual orientation, right? So the invisible identities, they kind of have this notion, you know, especially the strong ones, the ones that, you know, are kind of like the most talked about or have the most discord in the world, is that they, because of social constructs, they create a notion of hierarchy. And as Ashley said, those are things that we don't have to think about. Like, I'm pretty sure, like, I don't have to, my brother doesn't have to. There was a situation where practically he went to a mechanic and got charged like $100, and I went to the same mechanic for the same thing and they charged me like $500. It literally happened like 2 days ago. And like that's something that he didn't think about when he walked in there. But the first thing I had thought about, I was like, oh, this is because I'm a woman. And he's like, what do you mean? Like, what does that, like, what do you mean it's because you're a woman? And I'm like, you don't have to think about that. So that's something that you don't have to worry about, right? So that's when, like, when we talk about visible identities, like, what are some things? And as Ashley said, some of the things that we don't even have to think about, right? They exhibit some sort that we acknowledge that we have some sort of privilege when it comes to that. But what can we do with that? Like, what can we do with that privilege? How can we help others? How do we recognize that we have this privilege, and how can we help others who don't have that privilege navigate in the world?
Definitely, yeah. And I just realized that we are quickly running out of time, so I just want to real quick go through the end of this presentation, and we have someone asking in the chat if they can get a copy of this recording. Definitely, this will be posted. So just real quick to kind of sum up, this can be really overwhelming. Like, what do I do with all this? Where do I start? So I'd encourage you, for those of you who are transition-age youth in the audience, to think about how this might relate to your goals, around transitioning to adulthood, whether that be finding a job and moving out, or just, learning how to be more independent, learning how to do small things that can build your independence. I would encourage you to think about how that relates to your goals for leadership, because when we know ourselves, I think that's the takeaway, is that when we know ourselves, we can know better what we want for life and plan out how to achieve our goals. And it can be hard when we're part of a marginalized group, like someone with a disability, or any of these other things that we talked about. The world, unfortunately, like exactly like that example Kalia just gave, sometimes the world doesn't always respect us, but we have the power to change that. There's really a power in naming your identity and owning it and taking control of it. So this is a photo of a disability pride protest. Speaking of Disability Pride Month, with the banner reading the caption, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere," which is a Martin Luther King quote. So had to rush through those last few points, but hopefully you're still all thinking about okay, you have all this information about yourself, now what do you do with it? And that is entirely up to you. Kalia and I can't tell you what to do about that. That's really up to you, what you want to do with who you are in the world. So
yeah, and just remember that intersectionality is very complex. Personal identity is complex, and it always evolves during your lifetime. And the important part about it is that, just thinking about it and thinking about intersectionality and your identity, it's sort of like respect for diversity and of your identities that need to exist within each of us, so that it's essential to building a vibrant, inclusive, and community for everyone, and creating a sustainable life. I always tell people that I just want an inclusive, a happy, and sustainable life. And I think acknowledging your identity and acknowledging how you walk through the world is a very important part of that.
Oh, that's beautiful. Yeah, well, thank you all so much for being here. It really, really means the world to us that you all are here. On the slides, I have our emails, and I have some ways that you can connect with Peel on social media. And like we mentioned, this recording will be shared with everyone else, and I will turn it back over to Kala just to wrap up and share any other last details.
Thank you so much, Zoe and Kalia, and everyone for participating. What a great and very important conversation. We do have just a couple poll questions because we didn't have registration for this. We just need that for our grants. I think there's 3 questions. If Zoe could share that real quick.
Yeah, can everyone see that? I just launched the polls.
Fabulous.
That are just some demographic questions that we need for our grants, but it's all anonymous. We'll only be collecting the numbers, not attached to anyone's names or anything like that.
Thanks, Zoe. If you could just I can't see them because I'm the host. If you could just either screenshot them when they're done or tally them up, that would be great for me. I appreciate it. And we will be posting this presentation on our webinars page on peelcenter.org, and we will also share the link on our social media. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you all for being here. It's so amazing to see you all. And keep a lookout. We'll probably have more webinars and more trainings coming up in the future. So feel free to keep in touch with us. And yeah, you all were great. Thanks so much.
Great job. Thanks, guys.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.